In the Quran, God describes himself as he who knows the secret of men's hearts and warns people to avoid all kinds of evil. A Muslim, therefore, which means one who surrenders himself to God, must evidently be someone who does his best to fight terrorism. A Muslim does not remain indifferent to what goes on around him and never adopts the mentality that nothing matters as long as it does not harm him. That is because he has surrendered himself to God. He is His representative and an ambassador of good. He cannot therefore remain indifferent in the face of cruelty and terrorism. In fact, the Muslim is the greatest enemy of terrorism, which kills people who have done no wrong. Islam is against all forms of terrorism and tries to prevent it right from the beginning, in other words, on the level of ideas. It demands peace between people and for justice to prevail, and commands people to avoid discord, conflict, and wickedness. The true justice described in the Quran commands man to behave justly, making no discrimination between people. God commands believers to protect people's rights, not to permit violence no matter what the circumstances, to side with the oppressed against the oppressor, and to help the needy. This justice calls for the rights of both parties to be protected when reaching a decision in a dispute. Assessing all aspects of an incident, setting aside all prejudices, being objective, honest, tolerant, merciful, and compassionate. A person should incorporate the values of the Quran into his soul in such a way that he may be able to consider other parties' interests before his own and maintain justice, even if this harms his own interests. God commands the following in Surah 5, verse 42. If you do judge, judge between them justly. A person who fears God and knows that he will be called to account in the hereafter will rule with justice in order to win God's approval. In the Quran, God gives a detailed description of justice and informs believers of the attitude they have to adopt in the face of incidents they encounter and of the ways to exercise justice. Such guidance is a great comfort to believers and a mercy from God. For this reason, those who believe are responsible for exercising justice in an undivided manner, both to earn God's approval and to lead their lives in peace and security. The justice God commands in the Quran is the justice that is exercised equally among all people, with no consideration of language, race, or ethnicity. The justice in the Quranic sense does not vary according to place, time, and people. In our day, too, there are people being subjected to cruel and unjust treatment because of the color of their skin or of their race in all corners of the world. However, God informs us in the Quran that the purpose of the creation of different tribes and peoples is that they should come to know each other. Different nations or peoples, all of whom are the servants of God, should get to know one another. That is, learn about their different cultures, languages, traditions, and abilities. The purpose of the creation of different races and nations is not conflict and war, but cultural richness. Such variation is a bounty of God's creation. The fact that someone is taller than someone else, or that his skin is yellow or white, neither makes him superior to others, nor is it something to feel ashamed of. Every trait a person has is a result of God's purposeful creation, but in the sight of God, these variations have no ultimate importance. A believer knows that someone attains superiority only by having fear of God and in the strength of his faith in God. This fact is revealed in Surah 49, verse 13 as follows. O mankind, we created you from a male and female, and made you into peoples and tribes so that you might come to know each other. The noblest among you in God's sight is that one of you who best performs his duty. God is all-knowing, all-aware. As God informs us in the verse, racial differences among people have no importance. The understanding of justice recommended by God calls for equal, tolerant, and peaceable treatment of everyone, with no discrimination between them. Those who think that they will be successful by causing wickedness, upheaval, and oppression, and by killing innocent people are committing a great error. God has forbidden all acts of wickedness involving terrorism and violence, and condemned those who engaged in such acts. Islam is a religion which provides and guarantees freedom of ideas, thought, and life. It has issued commands to prevent and forbid tension, disputes, slander, and even negative thinking among people. In the same way that it is determinedly opposed to terrorism and all acts of violence, it has also forbidden even the slightest ideological pressure to be put on them. God commands in Surah 2, verse 26 that there is no compulsion in religion. The world we live in contains societies with all kinds of beliefs: Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, atheists, deists, and even pagan. Muslims living in such a world must be tolerant of all beliefs that they come up against, no matter what they may be, and behave forgivingly, justly, and humanely. This responsibility placed on believers is to invite people to the beauty of the religion of God by means of peace and tolerance. The decision whether or not to implement these truths, whether or not to believe, lies with the other party. Forcing that person to believe or trying to impose anything on him is a violation of Quranic morality. A model of society in which people are forced to worship is completely contradictory to Islam. Belief and worship are only of any value when they are directed to God by the free will of the individual. If a system imposes belief and worship on people, then they will become religious out of fear of that system. From the religious point of view, what really counts is that religion should be lived for God's good pleasure in an environment where people's consciences are totally free. The history of Islam is full of the tolerant practices of Muslim rulers who have respected all religions and built religious freedom with their own hands. For example, Thomas Arnold, a British missionary employed in the service of the Indian government, describes that Islam favors freedom in these words: "But of any organized attempt to force the acceptance of Islam on the non-Muslim population, or of any systematic persecution intended to stamp out the Christian religion, we hear nothing." The very survival of these churches to the present day is a strong proof of the generally tolerant attitude of the Mohammedan governments towards them. Killing a person for no reason is one of the greatest sins related in the Quran. In the Quran, a person who kills innocent people for no reason is threatened with a great torment. In Surah 5, verse 32, God informs us that killing even a single person is as evil as murdering all mankind on earth. A person who observes God's limits can do no harm to a single human, let alone massacre thousands of innocent people. Those who assume that they can avoid justice and thus punishment in this world will never succeed, for they will have to give an account of their deeds in the presence of God. That is why believers who know that they will give an account of their deeds after death are very meticulous to observe God's limits. One of the most important features of the morality that will lead believers to salvation on the day of judgment and to enter into paradise is being one of those who urges each other to compassion, as God says in Surah 90, verse 17 of the Quran.